What do you get when you cross trains with the National Park Service? Today on the Roundhouse, we're talking to the Superintendent of Steamtown National Historic Site. All aboard!
In days past, the Roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 47 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby, you name it, and we discuss it. And today we are talking to Debbie Conway. She is the Superintendent of Steamtown National Historic Site. I know that many of you have wanted to hear this particular interview and to learn more about what goes on behind the scenes of Steamtown, how they're working to preserve the railroading of days past, their own equipment, and what their plans are for the future. Debbie goes into some great detail about that. Before we get to that, though, I want to remind you guys that our 2016 Roundhouse Survey and Northeast Corridor giveaway is going on. You go to theroundhousepodcast.com/survey, complete a short 5-minute survey about the show. Even if you're a brand new listener, you can still complete the survey and enter for your chance to win 2 tickets aboard a former Pennsylvania Railroad observation car from Philadelphia to New York City on October 30th. You don't want to miss that trip. I've extended the deadline to enter to September 14th, the end of the day. So go to theroundhousepodcast.com/survey. I want to thank our partners at Luxury Rail Travel for making this possible. Our guest today is at the throttle of one of the most unique forms of rail preservation here in the United States. She is the Superintendent of Steamtown National Historic Site. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Debbie Conway.
Thanks, Nick.
Glad to have you on the show. How did the Steamtown National Historic Site form?
Actually, Steamtown started as a private collection. A man, Nelson Blount, who was a seafood businessman in the seafood business, had a love of trains at an early age. He grew up near a rail yard, used to go over and watch the trains, got to know some of the engineers. They gave him rides. So he just had this love of railroads and trains. And so when he really made his fortune, he started buying old steam engines. It was about the time when steam was being phased out of various railroads. And that is what he kind of grew up with and loved. And so he started putting together a really nice collection of steam locomotives, and he created Steamtown USA, which was up in Vermont, Bellows Falls, Vermont, and ran some excursions up there. Unfortunately, Mr. Blount had an untimely passing, and his foundation continued with the site, but they knew that they were going to have to find a more permanent home. They really started looking at Scranton because of the old DL&W rail yard there. So there was a big push to bring Steamtown USA, this private foundation with this great collection of railroad rolling stock, to Scranton. And it didn't take long after they kind of got the momentum to come to Scranton that the momentum to make it a national park became clear. And that really happened for a couple of reasons. Not so much just because of Mr. Blount's collection. Thank goodness he saved all those pieces. It was a great starting point for the park. But really, if you look at the history of Scranton, there were 5 major railroads that operated out of Scranton in its heyday. It's where, T-Rail really was developed in the United States to start numerous rail lines. Then you have the coal business, the anthracite business from the valley. There's just so many things that kind of tie in with that segment of industry and railroad development here in Scranton that made it a really logical fit to really talk about our country's, the role our railroads played in the development of our country.
And there is so much railroad history to explore. What's interesting is that when the general public thinks of the National Park Service, they think of the nature national parks. They think of Yosemite, they think of the Grand Canyon, but they don't think of places like Steamtown, because Steamtown's not alone in terms of being a man-made historic site. So can you explain for us how Steamtown fits the National Park Service's mission?
As I really mentioned, we're here to tell a story and preserve a story and the associated objects that go with that story. So in this case, it's steam engines and the rolling stock of that period. And we're really telling the story of how railroads, specifically steam railroads, because that was the mechanism at the time, really helped develop the United States. It's not just about collecting and maintaining these iron horses, but it's about telling the story of how they helped to develop the country, westward expansion, the Industrial Revolution that is tied to steam power and an ability to move product farther and faster, the changes that happened socially within our country. Used to be, if you lived in a small town, you were probably in an agricultural society. How we got those goods to market totally changed. How fast you could get things to market changed. How fast you could get to the city to take a different type of job changed. So it's about all those different aspects of the development of our country is the story that we are here to preserve. And iconically, we do it through the preservation of these great mechanical beasts.
For someone who's never been to Steamtown, describe what the site is like. What are some of the things that people would see?
We maintain over 60 acres of the old Delaware-Lackawanna Western Rail Yard. It is still an active rail yard. There is freight traffic that moves through it on a regular basis, on a daily basis. And then there's our trains that we're operating. During the summer months, we're operating trains pretty much every day. So it's an active rail yard. We have the remnants of the Roundhouse, which parts of it have been converted into museums. So we have a visitor center that is your place to kind of meet and greet and get your orientation. We have two museums, one on the technology of the rail yards and the railroads, another one on the history. Then we have a section of the historic Roundhouse that is preserved as a roundhouse and holds many of our historic steam engines, not all of them, but many of them. And then we also have an active locomotive restoration shop. And that shop is really there and maintained to kind of preserve the skills and the crafts that were used to maintain these historic engines. So when you go into that shop, if you go on a ranger guided tour into the locomotive shop, you are not seeing modern computer operated equipment that machines out parts like you might see in a factory today. You're seeing older technology and craftsmen that have really honed their skills and are good machinists and carpenters and so forth that help maintain our equipment that we operate, but also are helping us to restore additional equipment.
I think the way the Roundhouse in particular has been presented, it's such an interesting mix of exhibits. There are the modern updates with the displays and such, but particularly the skywalk around the original part of the Roundhouse. It connects people with the equipment in a very close way and in a very different way, because even some of the roundhouses that are open, usually you're walking around the shop floor.
Almost an aerial view of the engines. You're almost, if you want to say, face-to-face with them. I mean, you are looking at them straight on, and you can really gain a perspective of the size and dimensions of how powerful these pieces of equipment were when you're looking at them. And you're looking at them very closely. I mean, you are just a few feet away from the front of those engines, which is really kind of a nice perspective to have.
What are some of the other ways in which you try to tell that story that the public can relate to and connect to?
And I think the human side of the story is something that, most people can connect to, either looking at the various different jobs and roles people had on the railroad. In this area in particular, almost anybody you talk to on the street had a family member that, whether it was a grandparent, an uncle, that somehow had a connection to a railroad or to one of the coal mines. So it's an easy thing to connect because you hear that all the time. Oh, my grandfather used to work on. But I also think, nationally speaking, most people, most kids especially, at one time or another, you're mesmerized by trains. It's the trains crossing the track while you're sitting there waiting in the car with your parents. It's a model train that you see around the Christmas tree every holiday. It seems like there's a phase that everybody goes through where there's an appeal that the trains and railroads have. In many cases, some people will outgrow that and move on to something else, but in many cases, people haven't outgrown that, and they still find these trains and railroads really intriguing and an interesting part of history. It's not something that, unless you're in one of the big cities and you take a commuter rail into work every day, most people taking a train for a trip is kind of a special thing, whether you're getting on Amtrak for a trip or you take a special scenic railroad tour. Unless you're a commuter and uses it, it's something special. So I think it just has this flavor to it as something that is a little bit of exciting and a little bit, I guess, unique to it, that people kind of get a little bit of excitement and mesmerization by it.
For you, Debbie, how did you work your way up through the National Park Service to become superintendent of Steamtown?
Well, I've been with the National Park Service for 30 years now. So I started out, I don't know how familiar you are with our pay grades, but we start off with a general schedule, and the lowest level is a GS2. So I started actually below that as a volunteer, and then as a GS2, seasonal, working at a national park in Ohio, which is where I originally grew up. We used to take family vacations, and obviously going to, like you said, the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone were some of those big trips that we had when I was a kid, and I always was mesmerized by the rangers and what they did, and enjoyed going to the campfire programs or the historic tours or whatever. And so I think those early family vacations really drew me to the Park Service. And then once I got in, it was a matter of finding what I guess I would say is my niche, which was really working with the visitors and the public and doing the public programs, much like I enjoyed watching when I was a child. And so unfortunately with the Park Service, typically in order to move up, you have to move to another park. Unless you're in a really large park, it's hard to move up within a park often. I've moved around the country from East Coast to West Coast and back again, basically, and have worked in numerous places. My first opportunity to be a superintendent was at a small park out in Seattle, Klondike Gold Rush National Historic Park. And I was out there for 4 years as superintendent, and then moved east to Fort Stanwix National Monument, which again was a chance to move up and take a promotion as superintendent of that site. I had some opportunities to do some temporary assignments from there, and then quite honestly, 2 years ago, Steamtown came open, really unfortunately because of the passing of Kip Hagan, the previous superintendent. Personally for me, my husband and I have enjoyed trains and worked at Cuyahoga Valley where there was a scenic railroad. My husband is an O-gauge lino collector, so we've dabbled in that a little bit. We've taken, scenic railroad excursions on some of our vacations at various places, and so it was an interesting story to me, but it was also very close. My husband is still in upstate New York where we were living before, and so he was not in a position to move. So this was still close enough that I could actually move up into another position and get some new challenges and actually still stay connected to my husband and our household in New York. So it was appealing for that way as well. But it's a great story, and I enjoy being part of it.
Considering that story and that history, as you became more familiar with Steamtown and more familiar with the history that it's working to convey, what element of that history surprised you the most, that stood out to you, that you'd never thought of before in steam railroading and the industry behind that?
Wow, that's a tough question. I know I would say one of the things that being a Park Service employee and coming into a park that operates a railroad, the complexity of the railroad operation was something that really kind of threw me for a bit of a loop. I mean, again, I had worked at Cuyahoga Valley that had a scenic railroad, but the railroad there was very much run by a partner organization, and my involvement in it was very much focused on the programming that we did on the trains and not the day-to-day operation of the railroad. So really getting up to speed with FRA regulations and all the things that we have to do to be able to maintain our fleet and operate safely, that one really, I shouldn't say threw me, but that was like, wow, that's a much bigger task and a real challenge that I hadn't thought about. And I mean, it's one of those things that I'm learning every day. Every day I learn something new about the operation and about how the trains work and so forth that, I just never really expected. There were so many facets to it. But to kind of get back to your original question, what aspect of sort of the steam railroading history, I guess probably, I'll be honest, I did not realize that the steam engines ran as late into the 20th century as they did. Really, it was the 40s and into the early 50s was really the transition between steam and diesel. And to realize that some of those steam engines ran into the 50s was a bit of a surprise to me. So, learning some of that side of the history was kind of new to me.
It's true that Steamtown does have quite a long list of railroad partners. You have everything from the historical societies who call Steamtown their home for pieces of equipment like the Lackawanna Painted F units, like the RS3 that's there. And then that moves up to groups that you've partnered with for excursions, like the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society with Nickel Plate 765, all the way up to Norfolk Southern and Canadian Pacific. These are some pretty massive players and quite a mix. So how do you coordinate all of that, especially when it comes to putting on the events that Steamtown hosts?
We're very fortunate that we have a lot of strong partners already existing. I didn't have to necessarily come in and develop those relationships right from the start, which is great. And we also have a really great cadre of volunteers. One group that has kind of come together that calls themselves the Friends of Pennsylvania Northeast Railroading. I mean, most of these folks have a rich railroading history themselves. They either worked for one of the railroads or their family members did, and they are passionate. So they have kept a lot of those connections going, and it's really been advantageous because I think of one of our volunteers, Norm Barrett, who worked for CP, retired from CP, but he knows so many people, not just with CP, but with other railroads. And so when we have a challenge or we're looking to do something, he is a great person to be able to reach out and use those personal connections that he has to start the conversation for us, which is really great. As far as managing the partnerships and those relationships, one of the things that I have said to the partners since I've been there is I love partnering. I love being able to work with organizations to kind of further our mission. But I jokingly say, although I'm also serious at the same time, I come with baggage. Being part of the federal government, I come with a lot of baggage. There's a lot of hoops to jump through to make some of our formal partnerships work. And if you're willing to sit down and work through those hoops, and some of them take a little time to jump through and get to the solution on, but if you have patience and you're willing to do that, we can come up with a formal relationship that will be beneficial to both of us, hopefully. And I think an excellent example of one of the really beneficial relationships that we have is with the Anthracite Railroad Historical Society. They have one F3, and then the Tri-State Group, they lease that a second F3 from them. But our relationship, technically, our partnership agreement is technically with Anthracite Railroad Historical Society for both of those units since they have the lease agreement. But anyhow, that partnership is really one that I see is very, very beneficial to both of us. I mean, they have taken the time to restore and maintain these equipment. It's really probably better for them to be running on a fairly regular basis, especially right now with some of our motive power challenges, because we have stuff in the shop that we're still working on trying to repair. I mean, literally for the last several years, even before I got there, those engines were really keeping us running. And so it's just been a really win-win for everybody. It's a great relationship that we have with that group. I really think we need to continue to develop our relationships with some of the larger Class 1 railroads, like you mentioned, Norfolk Southern and CP, obviously. We were starting the relationship with CP, and then the line sold. So now we really need to develop that relationship a little bit deeper with NS. So that, one, events like RailFest that we've alluded to, that they continue to support it. I mean, they were great about bringing in their first responder engine last year, and they helped get some other equipment here. We just need to kind of strengthen that relationship so that it's a no-brainer that they're going to be there to help support things like RailFest and hopefully maybe some special excursions in the future.
Partially because that's supporting the National Park Service. I mean, congratulations on your 100-year birthday. That's impressive on a national scale. And sometimes that rail park service relationship isn't always direct. Sometimes it's moderately direct. You look at, say, Glacier National Park, where you could take Amtrak to get there. But then it becomes really direct with sites like yours or the Grand Canyon, where somebody can ride the train to the Grand Canyon. Any case where that connection to such an important national institution can exist and can be benefited from, I think any company worth their weight in salt should be willing to invest in that.
Well, it's interesting because, again, the National Park Service, with our centennial, it's a great time to reflect back on our agency's history and the development of the national parks. But railroads played a huge role in the development of the national parks, especially the big western parks. You mentioned Glacier, Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon. It was a lot of the railroads that first brought the first visitors and some of the early tourists to those parks and built some of the lodges and the other great architecture that those parks are known for today. Really helped open them up and develop them as, I guess you could say, tourist attractions. I mean, it was great that we had them preserved for future generations to enjoy and to preserve the great resources there. But really, for people to really appreciate them, you had to get out there and see them, and the railroads were the way to do that historically.
This past year, you succeeded in firing up your little 060 switcher, Baldwin number 26, and it's been great to see photos and video of that active again, even in just its yard duties. It's good to have live steam coming back to the site to join the ranks of all the steam engines that are on display.
I would second that. It is great to have it back.
The two celebrities of past that a lot of rail fans certainly associate with Steamtown have been former Canadian National number 3254 and my personal favorite, number 2317 of the Canadian Pacific Railway. These two steam locomotives last saw service about 2010, if memory serves me correctly. What is it going to take to put them back into service, both in terms of labor, costs, time frame? What is the projections with those?
One of the things that I found when I got to Steamtown is I really felt that we needed to take a little bit of a step back and develop a strategy for our equipment overall. Between engines, locomotives, and rolling stock, we probably have somewhere about 120 pieces of equipment that the park owns. There's really not a good overall strategy for what we were planning to do with those pieces of equipment. And unfortunately, I'm sure if you've been to Steamtown, you know out in the rail yard, we have several tracks filled with equipment that unfortunately is deteriorating. And some of it, quite honestly, is probably too far gone to save. We actually will have a few pieces of equipment probably leaving in the next couple of weeks. One, definitely in a dumpster because it's falling to the ground. I don't want to see that continue to happen, so we really need to develop a strategy in what we're doing with this equipment. And so I know your question was specifically about two engines, but what we've started to do and really are in the midway through is the development of an equipment strategy that'll help us determine what pieces of equipment we need to operate for our excursions and yard shuttles, what pieces are historically significant but really just need to be static and on display so that we can tell their story, and then really looking at, do we have equipment that is excess to our needs or, quite honestly, is beyond saving, so to speak, because it's either too costly or be prohibitive to try to do something with. So we're really going through a strategy right now to kind of define what pieces fit in those categories. Honestly, I know that the third category, the access to our needs, is not necessarily going to be a popular one in some cases, but the reality is with shrinking budgets and so forth, I can say safely that we're not able to probably maintain everything we have. And it's obvious by what you see happening in the rail yard that we haven't been maintaining everything that we have. So we have to make some tough decisions. So we're going through that process right now. Now, that said, one of my observations is that I feel in order to fully operate the site and be able to maintain a solid schedule of excursions on the weekends and run our yard shuttle both during the week and on the weekends during the summer, that we probably need to have at least 4 operating steam engines. Obviously, the 26 was the first one that came online. Probably, I mean, it's a great little engine, don't get me wrong. It's great on the yard shuttle, but it can't really leave the yard. It's not powerful enough to go out on the main line. So probably wouldn't have been, if we had started a strategy, maybe the one that would have been the top choice to get restored first. But we do have it, and we're going to keep her going. And so we're looking at what are the next 3 engines to restore. Obviously, the Boston and Maine 3713 is already apart and down to bare bones. So that's a logical one for us to continue moving forward and get that restored. Plus, we also have a partner that has signed a fundraising agreement with us. The Lackawanna-Wyoming Valley Railway Historical Society is helping us to raise the money to get that engine back together. That makes 2 engines that are in our sites. So we have to really decide on 2 others. And I'll be honest with you, we've had wide discussions about a variety of them. Definitely one of the 2 Canadian engines that you mentioned would probably be one of the remaining engines. We've also talked about the 790, which presently is on static display. One of the reasons we've looked at the 790 is because it is an engine that doesn't mind going backwards, and since we don't have that many Ys or places to really turn the engine on the main line, it is important that whatever engines we restore don't mind going backwards. There's a few that I think prefer not to. That said, we haven't made a final determination on which engines are going to be the other 2 that we restore, but really it's going to come down to a thorough condition assessment, and then the other next step we need to do is put together funding packages to go through our budgeting cycle to try to get funds to restore them. You also asked about time frame. Our budget cycles are, right now we're in fiscal year 16. Fiscal year 17 is basically already in Congress and being planned. So we're forecasting now for fiscal year 18 and beyond. And the reality is if we put something in this year, we're probably looking a minimum of 5 years before it would get funded. So this is going to be a long, drawn-out process to get us back operating with 4 engines. And it's going to be tricky because by the time we get the funding for probably engine number 3, we're going to need to be taking the 26 in for its 1472 day. So we really have to start planning a little bit more strategically and get in a good funding cycle for our projects. The other thing that I think is going to be a game changer for us is the development of the Iron Horse Society at Steamtown, which is a new nonprofit that's developing to be specifically a friends group for Steamtown. And that group, once it gets its IRS 501c3 status, we'll go forward with a fundraising agreement with them, and they can be a partner to help go out and fund projects, very specific projects. So even though our cycle may take 5 years or better, their cycle may not, and it may be able to help us speed up that plan a little bit.
That's an incredibly detailed response. I think a lot of people appreciate understanding more what goes into even just the fiscal planning before anyone's turning a wrench on any single locomotive.
No, I just think it's really important. I've had many people that like to see things happen a lot faster, and quite honestly, so would I. But I guess, as I say, I have baggage I come with. Some of the things I come with are a very slow budget cycle, funding possibilities, and then a lot of hoops that you have to jump through to get there. So I think it helps people to understand that we're not just sitting here ignoring what's going on. It just really takes a long time for us to move through that process. And quite honestly, we need to get more projects in the system ready to compete for funds. They're just not there right now. And so that's something we've been working on the first 2 years I've been here, is doing this analysis and why this equipment strategy is so important. It doesn't make sense to throw in a bunch of projects into our funding cycle to either restore a piece of equipment or to say we want it to be static exhibit or whatever if we really haven't determined what's the best use for that piece of equipment yet.
And it seems like this steam team that you're assembling, these 4 locomotives that would be within your goals, you're looking at something to cover the yards, 2 locomotives to cover the main line, and a 4th that could be kind of a mixture of both. When you hit that goal 25, 30 years from now, whatever it's going to take to see that, then that's going to give you a lot of flexibility in terms of your operations, even more so than it does at present.
My goal would be that Steamtown is never without steam again. I think that has to be a high priority goal. And looking at it, again, our basic schedule, even not thinking about expanding and doing a lot of different creative things, which I think we have some potential to do, I think we need to have a train that runs our yard shuttle, a train that runs on the excursion main line, a backup in case something breaks, and then that fourth engine can be in for service. So if we get into a cyclic rotation where we have one engine getting its 1472-day, inspections and all the repairs that go with that, and then we have that still leaves us three engines to run, two that are really operating and one that's a backup or that we can cycle through. And it allows us flexibility to not max out the hours and the days on each engine. We can kind of spread it out over time, but we just need to be much more strategic than we have been and really plan how we're using the equipment and really forecast and predict a little bit farther out. I think that has been something that, and again, I mean no disrespect to previous management, but has been a little bit lacking, and we need to get a better long-term strategy so that we don't find ourselves in the predicament of not having any engines ready to go when we need another engine.
Good plan. Part of what's exciting to hear about as well is the formation of the Iron Horse Society, which is going to be this friends group. In this day and age, it's so important to consider the role that volunteers play, and especially energizing younger volunteers. So when you think about the ways in which Steamtown has connected with kids through its existence, but also through programs like the Rail Camp initiative run by the National Railway Historical Society, what are some of the avenues you can see for bringing the younger generation on board with this movement and with these particular goals?
Certainly. I mean, obviously, one thing that we are working on is rebuilding, I guess you could say, our education program. We started with a new program this last year, Railroads, Rivers, and You, which was a partnership with the Lackawanna Heritage Valley Authority. And it's tied into the rail yard, and then also the kids go out and learn a bit about conservation over on the river. It's designed for fourth graders. We were able to get some grant funding to put that together and also to provide bus transportation to bring groups out to pilot it. We just found out we got a second grant this year that'll allow us to bring out more kids in the next school year for that. So we really need to build our educational, our core standards-based educational programming for one. The other thing is I would love to see some sort of rail camp come back. I've kind of understand some of the challenges and what happened with it historically, I guess. I'd like to see if we can make something like that happen in the near future. I've been talking to some folks, and we'd kind of like to, whether it's rail camp or whether we take a little bit of a shift and go more towards STEM or STEAM camp, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, which is really huge right now. We are a great place to put STEM or STEAM into action. I mean, you talk about the technology of the railroads and the rail yard. There are so many ways you can kind of tie that into that STEM program. So we've talked about trying to use that kind of STEM curriculum with an A in there for arts to make it STEAM, and have STEAM at Steamtown, and kind of develop some sort of curriculum, whether it's a day camp during the summer or a curriculum for school programs that will really help tie in. I think that's still a little bit, couple years probably down the road, but we are working on that kind of concept. And then the other thing that we really need to do, and you mentioned how important volunteers are to us, they're huge to us. Actually, there's two things we have to do. One is really look at recruiting a younger, more diverse volunteer group. I've been on my soapbox about volunteers the last month or so. We have a great group of folks, but they are getting older. And unfortunately, we have more leaving us every year than coming in the door. So we need to really push our recruitment and find people that really have a passion and want to come and work with us, whether it's in the visitor center or on the trains. Understanding that the train program is an intense program to be able to learn and work up through the ranks on that. That's one thing, but we also need, as I mentioned about our restoration shop earlier, we really need to also look at how we develop the skill sets and that those traditional crafts and skills that we use in the locomotive shop. Those are really lost arts anymore. And we have, and unfortunately in the park, our staff, probably about 85% of them can retire in the next 5 to 7 years. And so we're going to lose a huge bit of institutional knowledge if we don't come up with a strategy to develop, for lack of a better term, an apprentice program or some sort of internship program where we can start to mentor some people and that will hopefully want to come in and gain jobs in the Park Service in those skill set areas as well.
Something that I think is important on the diversity front for recruiting is the fact that you, Debbie, to address the elephant in the room, are a woman in charge of this site. And having women who are visible within rail preservation, I think, is such a key part of making young girls feel like trains don't just have to be a boys' thing. And I think I've talked to a lot of women in the industry, and those barriers are being broken down. But the more that we have people like you in these leadership roles, that goes a long way too in saying this history is for anyone who chooses to pursue it.
Definitely. And it's kind of interesting. Obviously, I'm at Steamtown. We work heavily with the Delaware-Lackawanna Railroad, and Lori Ransom is the superintendent of the railroad there, so a female there. And although Larry Mulsky is the head of the Pennsylvania Northeast Regional Rail Authority, his right-hand woman is Charlene Doyle. And so there have been a few times where the three of us have been together for things, and we're like, sort of the women of Steamtown and Northeast PA railroading. So it's kind of fun to have a couple other women in the area that are also working in what has historically been a male-dominated industry. And again, I think it goes back to there's been a big push when I talked about the STEM curriculum, trying to get more girls, young girls, interested in those types of career fields. And I think we tie into that and we tie in and we can bring them into the rail yard. They can recognize that they can do anything. Railroad is not a place where they couldn't find themselves in a high-ranking position at some point in the future.
Using the trains as a teaching tool is a great way of bringing something which could otherwise be a niche interest or hobby and making it relatable to anyone and using it to instill skills and life lessons that can help anyone out. I think that's absolutely fantastic as a goal to pursue. Now, something that's coming up in the short term, though, that I'm sure you're excited about is the annual Rail Fest. And this year you have a particularly notable guest from the great state of New Hampshire.
Yes. It's really exciting. We have Pepper Sass, which is the 150-year-old steam engine from the Mount Washington Cog Railway. That engine is an engine that they typically display there, but since it's their 150th anniversary, they are taking Pepper Sass on a little tour, especially of the eastern United States, and we are one of the stops they are making. We have been working with the folks at Mount Washington Cog Railway probably for about 8 or 10 months now, talking about the possibility of this. They will be coming in just a few days before Rail Fest with Pepper Sass and getting her set up here on site. And she'll be here for Rail Fest, but also staying a little bit later into September. We don't know her exact departure date yet, but she will be staying for several weeks with us on display here at the park. And it's just kind of nice because, as you mentioned, it's the National Park Service Centennial. It's their 150th anniversary kicking off up at Mount Washington for the development of their railroad. And then this year actually marks the 30th anniversary of the creation of Steamtown. It was created as a National Historic Site in 1986. Didn't open until 95, but our actual creation as a national park was 1986, so we're also celebrating really our 30th anniversary as well. So a lot of good milestones this year to help celebrate at RailFest.
Besides RailFest, what are some of the midterm goals or midterm events, maybe even looking ahead toward 2017? What are some of the things that you're excited about?
A couple things that we're working on right now. We just had a meeting last week where, again, one of the things that I've been pushing is that we have to create more of an experience for our guests. It's not just about taking them say from point A, Scranton, to point B, dropping them off, and okay, there you go, have a good time and come back when the train's ready to go. We need to be thinking more about the entire experience. We've done that a little bit more this year. We just had the trip to Moscow for their street fair, which took place. I think we had 109 riders on that train that we delivered down to the town of the borough of Moscow for that fair. And from what I could tell, everybody had a great time. So we've been trying to do a little bit more of that type of trip planning. We just had a meeting last week about Halloween, which actually is one of my favorite holidays personally. And so we've got a couple ideas in the works. I can't say it's 100% definite, but we're looking at maybe a haunted roundhouse kind of program that would also, we'd have some trains during the day that have a Halloween theme, and then a haunted roundhouse in the evening that might kind of bring people out at a different time of day and get a chance to experience the roundhouse and the rail yard in a kind of different light. Obviously, one of the things that has been really popular the last couple of years is the delivery of Santa Claus to Steamtown in December. I have to say, when I got here 2 years ago, we work with the Lackawanna Heritage Valley Authority to deliver Santa to a number of communities up and down the Carbondale line, usually the first Saturday in December. For whatever reason, when I first got here, I found out we were dropping Santa Claus in the state parking lot here in Scranton, and just didn't quite seem right. So we suggested bringing Santa into Steamtown. The first year, we probably had maybe about 600 people come out to see Santa at Steamtown. I would say last year, and again, we had perfect weather, we probably had about 2,500 people come to Steamtown to see Santa Claus come into Scranton. It's just so great to see the kids and their excitement, and not only are they loving the trains, but they're loving Santa Claus coming in on the trains. So that one is always one that I look forward to. And again, about the same time of year, we will be having some holiday trains that we're working with the Lackawanna Wyoming Valley Historical Society on, and that'll take folks down to the borough of Moscow with a holiday theme. So those are some of the things we're working on in the next few months here that I think are pretty exciting.
Good to have a range and diversity of events. That haunted roundhouse one, sign me up. That sounds particularly creative.
Well, we're still working out the details, so don't hold me to it, but I think it's going to come through. That sounds like it's going to be a good one, so I really hope to pull it off.
One way or another, I'm sure it's going to come through. I feel very confident based on what you've described. It sounds like it would be a nifty thing and great way to give the public a different perspective. And anytime a place like a railroad museum or a church railroad can not reinvent its image, but just tweak its image for different holidays or different events, it makes it even more exciting to revisit, because then you're getting a new experience out of it each time. Something that you've hosted, these World War II reenactor weekends. I think that's another way of tying in history and bringing it into the 21st century in a way that people can see, that makes it exciting.
Well, and we try to do that. I know one of the, I guess you could say, first, I don't want to say complaint letters I got was somebody sent us a letter saying that you're doing too many military things, because we had a Civil War train and we had a World War II train kind of close together. And, my response was that railroads were an important part of those historical events. And so we're not here to just talk about the Civil War or to talk about World War II, but we look at how the railroads played a role in those events as well. So we try to make sure we tie it strongly to our mission. I think you're right, it's a great opportunity to bring some folks to the park that maybe they're not train buffs per se, but maybe they really like World War II or the Civil War or whatever, and it's a hook to get them in, and then hopefully they fall in love with the place as well. And I do think that some of the holiday opportunities that we offer is a great way to reach a different audience, and that's important. We have to keep, hate to say reinventing ourselves, but we can't just do the same events over and over again. Otherwise, again, unless you have folks in from out of town, you're going to get to the point, well, okay, we've done that. Let's do something different this weekend. It is an opportunity to keep bringing the same audiences back for a different experience, and that's what we're really thinking about.
Clearly, you've fallen in love with the place too, Debbie, and it's so great to hear your enthusiasm for these plans and the directions that Steamtown can go. The final two questions I have to ask you, first and foremost, just as a point of curiosity, I think everybody who's been to Steamtown has a particular favorite locomotive or piece of equipment. And so my question is, what would yours be? And the second part of the question is, what do you enjoy most about the work that you do?
Okay, well, favorite piece of equipment. Oh boy, probably right now. And again, there's a lot of pieces that are really cool, but probably in some ways, I really like the post office car that we have on display. To me, that is really unique. And again, you were talking about ways to connect. Everybody gets mail. So when you understand the differences between how we get our mail today and how we used to get our mail historically, it's kind of interesting. But that's a great car. As far as locomotives, boy, I don't know. That would be hard to say. Maybe the big boy. I mean, it's just such a huge engine. It's just so amazing how big and powerful that engine is. And then your second question, what do I enjoy most? I guess, I hate to say problem solving, but I feel like there's some challenges that I inherited when I got here. And I feel working through solutions to some of those challenges, like not having steam at Steamtown and, developing the strategy for our equipment and so forth, really is rewarding. I feel like those kinds of processes and decisions are going to really put the park in a good place. And, in 6 or 8 years when I retire, the next person coming in will be able to, whether they agree with it 100% or not, will be able to pick up the plan and say, oh, I see where she was going with this, and, can kind of pick it up and keep moving forward with it. So I think sort of some of that forward thinking and kind of problem solving, kind of laying the groundwork for like the next 10 years or better is really kind of exciting. And it feels like it's something that's very, very useful and very much needed for the park. That's kind of rewarding.
Handing it down for generations to come. Debbie, thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse and sharing so much of your ideas with Steamtown and what makes it great already. It's such a fantastic learning tool for sharing railroad history for the country, particularly the Northeast, but sharing what those of us who love about trains, what makes it so great. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Well, thanks for having me, Nick, and happy to chat with you anytime.
And now, the question of the day.
All right, last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking to Matt Donnelly. He is the branding specialist for Amtrak, talking about what it means to be communicating the importance of passenger rail travel and the history behind their heritage units. And that led to the question of how have you enjoyed traveling on Amtrak? This from Kyle Leonardo. I've only ridden Amtrak from New York Penn to Philadelphia on the Acela Express. It was a fast ride and much better than the bus. We left Penn Station 3 minutes late and pulled into 30th Street Station 2 minutes early. Way to make up time on the trip, Kyle, and Acela is definitely on my rail fanning bucket list, especially considering the fact that we're looking at that equipment being replaced in the not-too-distant future. This from Elizabeth Ozarek. Growing up in the Northeast Corridor in the 1960s and 70s, I often traveled by train. The trip that sticks out in my mind, though, is one I took in 1987. I traveled to Denver on Amtrak's California Zephyr to visit my cousin. I still remember waking up in the morning, looking across the plains, and seeing the Rockies rising up ahead, just like a picture postcard. First off, hi, Mom. Second, glad that you had a great trip on the California Zephyr. I think of the 3 westbound long-distance trains that Amtrak offers. From Chicago, that's the one that's at the top of my list. But it's always a toss-up with the Empire Builder, and you can't rule out the Southwest Chief. Just looks like I'm going to have to do them all. Your question of the day for this week is, what is your favorite piece of history at Steamtown? Let me know via the comments section on the roundhousepodcast.com or social media. Links to all social media on the website. Remember, guys, we are on iTunes, so if you like the show, you could subscribe to us there and leave us a review. That helps us out immensely, lets other people know that, hey, we're worth checking out. Appreciate it very much. And don't forget, we have got that survey going on where you could win your own private railcar experience at the roundhousepodcast.com/survey. Thank you guys for listening. As always, remember that the Roundhouse is our house.